Hey everyone, my name is Jack. Welcome back to the channel. I cover a variety of topics as they relate to real estate, investing, the markets, and pretty much everything as it has to do with personal finance. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to have a look around the channel. And if you like what you see, be sure to subscribe. But today I want to talk about a very peculiar situation that I found myself in after I closed on my first out-of-state rental property in Indianapolis, Indiana, just a couple of months ago. If you guys want to see the full numbers breakdown and what I was getting into when I actually closed on that property, definitely check out the video linked above. That's a full deal breakdown going through the numbers and all that great stuff, so you know exactly why I decided to go through with this deal. But one of the negative aspects of this deal that helped me to get a good price on it was the fact that the tenant was actually behind on rent. They had just stopped paying rent the month before we were set to close, and our closing date was the very end of July. And this was unexpected because the tenant did have 2 years of really good payment history, had been at that property for quite a while already, and had just renewed a lease to keep staying at that property right before it actually was put up for sale. So it's not as though this tenant is some deadbeat who doesn't care about paying rent, since the tenant had paid rent for 2 years without issue, and this was a very recent occurrence that hadn't happened before. Of course, there are deadbeat tenants out there, but thankfully this tenant is not, since most tenants are not actually deadbeats. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions with that when people are actually trying to get into real estate. There might be a lot of deadbeat tenants when you yourself are a deadbeat landlord, of which there are plenty of those as well, but thankfully, in the similar sense, most landlords are not deadbeats, and I'm going to get into what actually happened with my situation in just a second. But first I want to talk about real estate as a business, because real estate as a landlord on the property management or landlord side is ultimately a customer service business. This goes for multifamily, office, industrial, whatever it is. You have a relationship between a landlord and a tenant, with the tenant being the customer and the landlord providing a service, that being quality space. Landlords are like businesses that compete for customers. In this case, they try to compete with each other by offering better amenities or a cheaper access to housing. Totally depends on what each market does, but that's generally what's going on. It's a customer service market where if the landlord doesn't provide for the customer, they're not going to get any. So I guess this would be a good point to talk about slumlords, since those do exist, unfortunately, and really don't do anything good for real estate and do a ton of bad in ruining the reputation of actual good landlords. Slumlords are people who buy property and then do nothing to it and just charge very low rents but don't provide anything to tenants and let things fall into disrepair and just try to squeeze everything out of the property without actually taking any care of it. Often it becomes sort of an abusive situation where the landlord will do nothing to take care of their building and then ends up hurting the property values of buildings around them. You have people living in these buildings and maybe not taking care of them, because why would you take care of something if the landlord's not going to take care of it either? So it's just a very mess of a situation that unfortunately does happen from time to time throughout the real estate industry, and no area is truly safe from it. Being a slumlord or a landlord who just doesn't care is a net negative on the system, just as having a business that doesn't care about its customers, doesn't care about actually doing a good job, is also a problem. You're going to leave customers, or tenants in this case, in a worse position because you're not doing what you're really supposed to be doing in your line of business. For example, many state laws talk about the warranty of habitability, where you're supposed to provide something that is a minimum baseline of habitable, and there's no hazards that could cause harm to people on the property or around it. You're supposed to be taking care of that as a landlord, and that makes sense, and that's better for society as a whole. Even if it makes housing just a little bit more expensive on the aggregate, you're providing a lot more, and ideally would help property values around that area as well, which relieves everyone in a better position. And you don't want landlords to be deceptive either in offering something, saying that it's providing a service, good housing or affordable housing, when all they're really providing is a dump of a property, and that's no good. But what's the incentive to actually take care of the property, since that costs money to do? Well, let me give you my example as to what I did when I finally closed on this property despite the tenant being behind in rent. But right before I get to that, I actually want to talk about the special arrangement I made with the seller to buy myself some time in the event that the tenant wasn't going to be able to pay rent for the whole month after I closed. What I did is I actually negotiated a refundable credit for August rent from the seller. Now, I closed at the end of July 2020, as I mentioned. So what this credit would do is if the tenant ended up paying August rent before the very end of August, then I would refund that credit back to the seller. If the tenant didn't pay August rent, then I would keep that credit. So basically what I did is I got all of the rent up front for August. That way, if the tenant did pay rent, then I would just return the credit. Everything would be fine on my end. And if the tenant still didn't pay rent, then I would still have that money from the credit. So in short, I was insured for August rent. I was going to be getting paid August rent no matter what happened, whether that be on the seller's dime or on the tenant's dime like they're supposed to in their lease. But clearly there was something wrong with their situation and they needed some time to sort it out. So I thought I'd at least give them time to try and sort that out, since it wasn't going to really hurt me in either way. Not to mention you had the added layer of eviction moratoriums that made it very awkward to try and negotiate things with tenants who didn't necessarily want to leave because they didn't really have to unless you negotiated some sort of separate deal. But I'm not going to talk about eviction moratoriums in this video. That's a totally separate issue. But what ended up happening is I closed on this property and I knew I had till the end of August to really make a decision on what we were going to do with the tenant. If the tenant really still hadn't paid rent after the end of August, that would have been 2 months that the tenant hadn't actually paid rent. And that's a very long time in the real estate space, and it would be really clear grounds to try and get the tenant out of there. But because I negotiated that credit, I was able to give that time. But there was also some maintenance that needed to be done on the property, and obviously the tenant was still there. So it's a bit of an awkward situation in that I'm supposed to be providing good housing and taking care of this housing, but the tenant wasn't actually paying rent at the time. But there was some deferred maintenance that really needed to get taken care of because the previous landlord didn't do anything about it, but they did give me a credit to take care of some of it. But clearly they let some things go into disrepair. But they were trying to get rid of the property because they didn't want to take care of it anymore. But I decided that it made much more sense for me and really my property management team to get in there and actually do the deferred maintenance and take care of it. Now there was a risk here, and this is what people might hesitate with. You have a tenant who's not paying rent, and now you're going to go in and spend money on the property. Who knows what that tenant's going to do, if they have to move out, if it gets nasty, you have to do some sort of eviction or something like that. Now you're risking having your newly repaired stuff get broken if someone gets petty, which does happen. Again, that's not common, but it does happen. The alternative risk of not doing this work is that you'd give the tenant more reason not to pay rent because you're not taking care of the property. Things are in disrepair. Things are broken that shouldn't be broken. And that's a problem from a customer service standpoint. Even if your customer is being a little difficult right now or is in a bad situation and can't pay your bill, that's not cause to be rude or mean to them because they still have some leverage there and that they're in your property. In this case, there's an eviction moratorium, so you have to be really careful there too, since you can't necessarily get them out. And that's even in a landlord-friendly state like Indiana, where it's comparatively easy to actually get a tenant out of a property if they don't pay rent, compared to a state like my home state of Illinois. So rather than wait, I decided to go ahead and push through with that maintenance and get it all done and take care of the property, even though there was a chance that the tenant was still not going to be able to pay rent for potentially forever. I didn't know what was going to happen because I knew the tenant was worried. The tenant was very apologetic to our property management team that they were unable to pay rent, but what ended up happening after that maintenance was done, the tenant was super happy about it, which was great. It made us feel good that we were doing good work. But again, this isn't a charity business. We're providing a service and they're providing us with money to perform that service. But in this case, the money was being withheld for one reason or another because, well, they weren't able to pay rent. But thankfully, there's a happy ending here. And at the beginning of September, the tenant did end up paying rent and also paid October just recently. So everything seems to be back on track and we're all looking great. But I can't help but wonder what would have happened had I not gone through and fixed the things that really needed to be fixed. Would the tenant have really felt obligated to pay rent if they thought they were getting a raw deal? Why am I paying rent for something that's falling apart? You know, that's where you have to be very careful as a landlord. You are providing a service. When you have that lens, you'll know to take the steps that you should take to take care of the property, because when you take care of the property, more often than not, much more often than not, your tenant will take care of you as well. But that's the central lesson I really want people to get out of this, and that's that even if you might be in a pretty rough position, don't forget your obligation as a landlord to provide a good service. Because if you're providing a good service, that is the only way that you can really encourage people to start paying rent again if you're in a position where you can't evict them or you don't want to evict them. Not to say that you should be overly passive either, since obviously there are tenants out there who will abuse this sort of situation. Thankfully, most people aren't like that, so hopefully you don't get into that particular situation. But in my situation, all I needed was a little bit of time, basically 1 extra month, which I was able to buy using a credit, and then also making sure to keep taking care of that property, even though I wasn't sure I was actually going to get rent the next month. honestly, you never know when you're not going to get rent in a given month. So you just have to perform as though you will get paid for it. Because after all, you never know what a court's going to say either. If you don't take care of a property because the tenant's not paying rent, the tenant can use that against you in many cases, since they could say this property's not habitable, or the landlord's not providing the thing that they promised in the lease. So you have to be very careful with that from a legal perspective as well. Obviously talk with an attorney depending on what your situation is, but that is something to consider as well. But from a business standpoint, a landlord is ultimately someone who provides customer service, and that service is housing to the customer that is the tenant. Of course, your situation might be very different. Every situation is a little different, but generally I think this is a good way to take a look at managing rental property and becoming a landlord, since it really is a business and you are providing a customer service and you have to treat it that way. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. If you like this video, please like it since it helps the channel out a lot. And if you like this sort of content about real estate or investing and anything about personal finance for that matter, definitely be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new updates, since I put out new videos every single week. And check out my book, The One Property Retirement, about a simple strategy for building your retirement nest egg using real estate. It's great for beginners who might be new to real estate, or maybe you are familiar with real estate already and just want a different perspective, since it walks you through how to actually buy a property, run the numbers, vet the deal, and then actually get it through the closing process and beyond when you come to maintain and actually rent out the property. If you end up reading the book, definitely leave a review on Amazon, since that would help me out a lot. But until next time, take care.